My name is Dr. Reena Ramdev, and I teach at Delhi University Sri Venkateswara College. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Eurasia Foundation for inviting me to be a part of their 2022 program, and also extend my warm gratitude to Professor Asun for facilitating this. In my presentation today, I will be looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected certain sections of women in India by referencing domestic workers. I will also then look at women students and how the shift to e-learning has impacted them with the closing of university campuses during this time of the pandemic. This last year and a half of the coronavirus pandemic has led to a defining of our life and times through a pre and post pandemic historicizing. In its casual referencing, it gestures at the COVID moment as rupture, a break, that has ostensibly in its wake equalized vulnerabilities through a sharing of risks and threats. A sharing implied through common dictums seen circulating for all. Everyone need mask up, each one of us must stay home, all of us must practice social distancing, since social isolation, as it is reiteratively stated, remains our greatest shield against the virus. All this seems to indicate that the pathogen's infectability has intersectionalized social class, race, and in India, also importantly, caste and gender, as though we are all affected even when uninfected. The clamor for a united defense against a common enemy suggests that such a defense would protect one and all. And yet, this empathetic universality of we're all in it together elides and dismisses the unequal differential provisioning that imprisons lives and intensifies existing vulnerabilities in a living mediated by what Wendy Brown marks as, quote, the crude, careless powers of nation state and capitalism, unquote. The virus's discriminations are, as is now evident, discursive, playing out in degrees that effectively render the vulnerable and more precarious, exposing therein the horrors teeming under the Althusserian stone of our neoliberal economies. In his 2011 work on environmental disaster and climate change, Rob Nixon talks of slow violence. Slow violence is the violence of delayed destruction that incrementally builds over years, one that is easily glossed over by a hard charging capitalism's deflections and which further vulnerabilizes ecosystems of the poor and the disprivileged. There is, as he says, a relative invisibility that marks slow violence, and its effect remain both pervasive and elusive. And while there would be enough stories that mark and register the existence of this violence, the stories in their unspectacularity would never be the ones that count. The accretive effects would be difficult to relay through urgency, since it's easy to disequate a gradual build-up from an eventual catastrophic effect. As he says, how do we bring home and bring emotionally to life threats that take time to wreak their havoc, threats that never materialize in one spectacular, explosive cinematic scene? Policies that come from the longue durée of neoliberalism have that same attritional lethality. This moment of the pandemic, even as it catalyzes neoliberalism's infiltrative advance, also brings into magnified focus the afflictions that have always underpinned it. Attritional and long out of sight, the violence of the harm is visibilized in the many vulnerabilizings that it has made collaterals of. India's ranking in the Global Hunger Index 2021 slipped to 101st position from its 2020 position of 94th in a total of 116 countries. And yet, it is important to remember that this deepening of the poverty crisis is not solely related to the risk accompanying the viral contagion. It has been produced by the erosion of social welfare systems over the years in countries like India. The crisis of the pandemic has only intensified the many neglects and impoverishments that sectors of public good have suffered in the hands of the neoliberal state. Neoliberalism forges, maintains, and advances social inequities by dismantling collective identities and replacing them with individualized self interests. And how efficiently global capitalism insinuates itself within the current crisis, emerging stronger and signaling invincibilities is becoming more and more evident in these years of the pandemic. As Judith Butler Riley notes, quote, it is sometimes difficult and for good reason to distinguish between social events and effects that belong to the pandemic and those that belong perhaps more properly to capitalism. In a country like India, with its radical disparities of wealth, 2020's ill planned lockdown, with only a 4-hour notice time, exposed social fault lines and inequalities that have now been stretched to breaking point, all of which state policies had neglected for years, if not actively fomented. In her April 20 article, The Pandemic is a Portal, Arundhati Roy writes of the many crises that the COVID pandemic is a portal to. For, apart from the health crisis, it is also the hunger and hatred crisis which has been aggravated, brought upon a people by the state. In India, millions of daily wagers, migrant workers who worked in cities found themselves suddenly, with the enforced lockdown, incomeless and homeless. Walking hundreds of miles, many barefoot, straddling children to reach their villages, several workers died of exhaustion and starvation. And yet, as deaths of expendable bodies, these are deaths that will never be accounted as COVID statistics, as fatalities caused by the virus. As Roy says, quote, the lockdown worked like a chemical experiment that suddenly illuminated the hidden, the invisibilized. As shops, restaurants, factories, and the construction industry shut down, and the wealthy and the middle class enclosed themselves in gated colonies, our towns and megacities began to extrude their working class, their migrant workers, like so much unwanted accrual. Many driven out by their employers and landlords, millions of impoverished, hungry, thirsty people, young and old, men, women, children, sick people, disabled people, with nowhere else to go, with no public transport in sight, began a long march home to their villages. Unquote. In the starkest of ways, the pandemic has exposed structural problems of egregious injustice and inequality, all of which will only increase, and always with the heaviest toll on the poor. As ongoing research studies indicate, Indian women have experienced far more COVID related hardship than men in ways that are usually not recognized. While in India, women make up a significant proportion of all healthcare workers and more than 80% of nurses and midwives, yet when it comes to decision making roles in the health sector, they are largely absent, and there remains a stark disparity with their male counterparts. Literacy, internet usage, and smartphone ownership and usage is lower among women compared to men in India. Accessing and understanding health promotion messages increases knowledge, which needs to be accompanied with structural facilities and access to resources to adopt promoted preventive behaviors, for example, making soap and water available for hand washing. These gender gaps have resulted in lower adoption of promoted health behaviors and increased risk of infection for both women and girls. Compared to men, women were 7 percentage points likely to know the main symptoms of COVID-19. Of course, women Among women, there was a variation in knowledge by education level, urban residence, and household wealth. Women were 22 percentage points less likely to practice key preventive behaviors compared to men. Women were also more likely to report recent depressive symptoms than men. Findings underscore that COVID-19 is already disproportionately impacting adolescent girls and young women, and that they might require additional targeted gender sensitive messaging to foster behavioral change. What I hope to highlight in today's presentation is the toll that the COVID-19 outbreak in India has taken on a section of women who work as domestic labor in the capital city of New Delhi. For this, I will share two surveys and reports that my students who are a part of the Women's Development Cell in my college have worked on that draw attention to the plight of women domestic workers during the lockdown. I will also talk about the vaccination gender divide that has made it difficult for women to access and prioritize vaccinating themselves. Further, taking the university as my entry point, I will also talk of the impact that the pandemic occasioned e-learning has had on women students from disprivileged backgrounds. Historically, epidemics and humanitarian crises have disproportionately impacted the most vulnerable, including women and girls. In India, entrenched inequalities in access to education, job opportunities, and healthcare often leave women inadequately equipped to effectively protect themselves against infection during an outbreak. And they are more likely to bear secondary negative effects of prolonged crisis, such as economic insecurity or challenges accessing essential health services. Existing gender disparities in India have only intensified owing to pandemic driven adversities, and these are likely to affect women's abilities to make informed decisions about adopting behaviors that could mitigate the risk of being infected by the virus. I will now bring in a few news reports from the last 2 years of the pandemic that show how patriarchal and capitalist driven inequities faced by women, while deeply imbricated in the invisibility of women's experience, are picked up and mediatized in news reports in a spectacularizing that is self limiting, a showcasing for a moment staging only that is then to be relegated and forgotten soon after. In this, a deep cognitive dissonance is created as the violence is both seen and unseen by wider publics and society, remarked upon and yet made unremarkable. The question of who is vulnerabilized more under pandemic conditions also brings us back to a calculative index that judges whose lives are more readily dispensable and whose lives are treated as worthy of protection and also of living. This is a picture of Shakuntala, a migrant worker, and she, along with her husband, had been forced to leave the city after the lockdown was announced, since they had no means of sustenance after the factory that they worked in had closed. On a foot journey from Maharashtra to her village in Madhya Pradesh, she gave birth to a baby on the road. After giving birth, she had to further walk 150 kilometers before she could get medical attention. Her husband said, "After Shakuntala gave birth, we rested for 2 hours and then started our journey again and walked for another 150 kilometers." The second image here is that was also circulated widely in 2020, shows an exhausted woman dragging her suitcase on a highway in Uttar Pradesh's Agra on her walk to her village. Her son, around 4 or 5 years of age, worn out by the arduous journey, is seen here sleeping on the suitcase while his mother drags it. At this point, they had completed two-thirds of their 800-kilometer journey from Punjab, and this was, of course, entirely on foot. The third image that I'm sharing here is of 15-year-old Jyoti Kumari, who in desperation journeyed across 740 miles on her bicycle with her disabled father. Her father, unable to walk after an accident, had earned a living by driving an auto rickshaw. But with all non essential travel banned, he found himself among the millions of those rendered unemployed by the pandemic. Their landlord had demanded rent which they could not pay. Jyoti Kumari pedaled for 10 days, her father riding on the back of the bike. The temperature climbed and they survived on food and water given by strangers. Only once did Jyoti Kumari give her legs a break, accepting a short lift on a truck. An arduous journey that drew global attention and praise. And as she said, I had no other option. We wouldn't have survived if I hadn't cycled to my village. These widely circulated images found rapid circulation on both social and print media during the 2020 lockdown. And several civil society groups had responded with initiatives launched to provide financial aid to these and other women. As workers, part of the informal sector, women were the worst hit. And while many instances of trafficking and violence were filed, there remained scores that never found any form of reporting or redress. As news items, these images resonated within the span of a news cycle only, to be forgotten and discarded as the next one took over. Women's newsworthiness typically gets exploited within a terminology that is quick to both showcase and sensationalize even as the short-livedness is sublimated. These widely circulated images found rapid circulation on both social and print media. I will now share a set of interviews entitled Because of Them, conducted by my students who belong to the Women's Development Cell of my college. This was part of a campaign to collate and understand the toll that the lockdown of 2020 took on women domestic workers, who are again part of the informal sector that has not been able to legally mobilize labor rights. Part of the interview also included a question on the dreams that these women nurtured, both in their past and also leading to the present and future. This is the poster of the campaign that my students had organized. It was called Because of Them. And as I mentioned, this is the Women's Development Cell of my college. The first image here is of Krishna, who worked as a cook in different houses. She said that she could not complete her education beyond the 8th grade because that was the last level any government school offered in her area. When asked whether she had a dream as a young girl, Krishna says she could not dream. The situation at home was very bad, she said. I never got a chance to even think about it. Her family includes 7 members, and all of them lost their jobs during the pandemic. She had to borrow money from her employers to buy food and basic necessities. As she says, food for 7 people is expensive. This is how it was. Sometimes there was no milk, sometimes sugar. Some of her family members who worked in a factory were able to fight with the owner to get at least 50% of their salary. Some of the employers in whose houses she had been working for more than 10 or 15 years gave her basic items like masks and food. There were people who came to her area to distribute rations and masks, but as she said, they managed with a little help from friends, and that's how she survived. There are 2 children in her family, a girl who was in the 8th grade and a boy in the 7th. They were going to a private school, which is now demanding fees for the whole year for them to rejoin classes. Krishna contacted the teachers and they have asked her to pay at least 50% of the fee to be allowed to come to school again, which the family cannot afford. The second interviewee was Mamta, who is 23 years old and works as a house help along with her grandmother. And she works in about 9 or 10 different homes, she said. Her father is unemployed and she had started helping out her grandmother at a very young age. She studied till the fourth grade but could not continue because of the financial situation at home. However, she has started to learn to read and write Hindi only recently. On asking what it is that she wanted to be, she said, and I quote her, "I never gave much thought to what I wanted to be, but yes, I wanted to study and be someone at least so that I could lead a good life." Her grandmother raised both her and her brother. She was not comfortable talking about her family situation and the relations that she shared with her family. During the lockdown and the pandemic, they continued to work even during that time while taking precautions like wearing masks and using sanitizers. She talked about the fact that the ration that the government promised never reached them. She said it was better that they were able to work and at least earn, because otherwise things could have been terrible at home. On asking how they managed with the terror of the virus and the fear of having no earnings, she said, "Somehow we survived." Pinky is a house helper and she has been working even before she got married at a young age. She went to school only till grade 5. When asked how the last year of the pandemic was, she said that it was very difficult for her as she could no longer work, her earnings stopped, and she and her family managed to survive with the help of a few other families who provided her some money and rations. She also said that the government promised them free ration for the entire lockdown, but she received it for just 1 month. When asked about her dream, she started laughing and said, "I have always been surrounded by house helpers, daily wage earners, etc. When I was a child, I used to think that these are the only options to earn. I had no dreams. I knew I have to work as a domestic helper." The pandemic changed things. Several houses in which she used to work haven't re employed her, and she continues to face financial difficulties. The next image is of Neelam. Neelam's age is 40, and she says that she dropped out of school after the fifth grade to take care of her brothers. She migrated to Delhi from Ranchi in Jharkhand with her husband in the hope of a better life. In the initial days of her marriage, only her husband worked, but after the birth of their son, it was difficult for the family to manage on her husband's meager salary. Both parents also wanted to provide their child with a quality education, so Neelam started working as a domestic help. But last year, when the year before last, when the pandemic hit, the couple were out of work. Some of her employers did not pay her any salary. Fortunately, they had some savings for emergency situations. And as she said, at least it was enough to pay for household expenses. Sandhya is a domestic helper again, and growing up in an orphanage, she said that food was always too little, and every single child was destined to work only as a laborer. Like other orphans, she too started working as a daily wage laborer in a nearby brick kiln. She says she never dreamed of becoming something or someone. When the pandemic hit, her husband lost his job at the factory. Most households fired Sandhya without providing her due wages. She says that they had to borrow money from their landlord to help with the daily needs. The family has to repay loans. In the initial days of the pandemic, Sandhya's family was helped by local NGOs and government officials. But this help was limited to just about a month or so. What troubled Sandhya the most was the effect this would have on her children's education. For she believes that if they aren't educated, they would end up like her. Despite the hardships that they had to face, Sandhya feels that they were lucky to survive it. As she says, quote, there were many families who had to leave their home, sleep on the road, go for days without food. Many even lost their loved ones. At least we weren't one of them. This is Payal, a 16-year-old house help who had to start working last year before last in 2020 because of the pandemic. She has two younger brothers studying in the first grade and the third grade. Her mother had lost her job initially when the lockdown was imposed, and they had trouble making ends meet. They received no aid from the government and had to rely on the little savings they had. Although it was difficult for them to take necessary precautions as their work revolved going to different houses, she says they somehow managed to survive. When asked about her dreams, she said she wants to become a doctor and help underprivileged people get affordable treatment. She says she feels relieved knowing that she can continue her education as school is starting next week. She'll finally be able to study like others of her age and take a pause from household work. This is Antari, also called Amma, which means mother. She's 72 years old and she has been working as a house help for the last 20 years after the death of her husband. Antari Amma never went to school. As she says, in our jati, which is in our community, girls are not sent for education. I have not even seen a school. When asked what dreams she had when young, she answered, we were only taught household work as we did not know anything else. Amma has 8 children, 5 girls and 3 boys. All her girls are married and 2 of her sons live with her. One of her sons is a tailor and the other is unemployed. During the lockdown, her son, who is a tailor, did not have any work, and all of the expenses of running the house were covered by her salary. Antariyamma works in about 10 houses, but it was only 3 or 4 who agreed for paid leave, that too for not more than 1 or 2 months. So she mostly worked during the entire duration of the lockdown. She said she took precautions like wearing a mask and using sanitizers, but other than that, she wasn't worried about COVID. She was more worried about her family starving. Rations that the government sent never reached them, she said. I'm quoting her. Things were brought in big cars, but we never got anything. Everything would disappear. It never reached the poor. She did not ask the people she worked for help, just that the only thing that she said that she asked for is that she get her salary on time. According to a UN survey conducted in 2020 in 14 states and 10 urban centers of India, wage inequality and the burden of unpaid care has pushed more women out of employment and into poverty. Women's earned income in India was just 1/5 that of men even before the pandemic. A recent report by the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University in India shows that during the first lockdown in 2020, only 7% of men lost their jobs, compared to 47% of women who did and who were not able to return to work by the end of the year. In the informal sector, women fared even worse. In 2020, last year, between March and April 2021, rural Indian women in informal work accounted for 80% of job losses. Indian women also spend more time doing unpaid care work at home than men. On an average, they spend 9.8 times more time than men on unpaid domestic chores and 4.5 hours a day caring for children, elders, and the sick. During the pandemic, their share of unpaid care work grew by nearly 30%. Indian women perform 9.6 more unpaid labor in the form of care than men, 3 times the global average. In rural villages, since the lockdown, many men have lost their jobs, and women have had to find ways to support their families financially while also managing the household, cooking meals, and looking after children and family elders. Women have also had to put their own health on the line to support their families, and many have been eating less so that their families do not go hungry. In this, putting themselves even more at risk of becoming ill from the virus. The traditional conservative structures and roles that hold women back, which feminists on the ground have spent decades dismantling in India, may again begin to take hold. There have also been misogynistic memes circulating on WhatsApp that celebrate girls being at home, as they say, where they belong. But this isn't even the full price of the pandemic that women have had to pay. In a study published in June 2020, India's National Commission for Women reported a spike in domestic violence. As the COVID-19 lockdown trapped women at home, domestic violence rates spiked throughout the world. In India, reports of domestic violence, child marriage, cyber violence, and trafficking of women and girls increased within the first few months of the pandemic. According to the Commission's data, India recorded a 2.5 time increase in domestic violence between February and May 2020. Some women's organizations reported that in the first 4 phases of the lockdown, they received more reports of domestic violence than they had in the last 10 years for a similar period of time. Others indicated that many women were unable to report the violence as they had less privacy and means to access help. In addition, overcrowding of homes under COVID has intensified domestic violence, but many women cannot report this to the authorities due to lack of access to mobile phones. In this next part of my presentation, I will speak of the COVID vaccination gender gap that has existed since the start of the drive here in India. Right now, there is concern that fewer women than men are receiving their vaccination doses. 17% more men than women have been partially or fully vaccinated. And according to national data, there are only 2 states where more women are taking the vaccine. This again is part of a report put together by my students of the Women's Development Cell last year in 2021. This is the poster that they had created for their report. It says COVID vaccination gap through gender. India commenced its ambitious COVID vaccination drive on January 16, 2021, which is slowly gaining momentum. As of 13th July 2021, 37.6 crore of vaccine doses were given and 5.3% of the total population is fully vaccinated. This is from last year. In both access to vaccines as well as the information concerning its safety, women as a group lag. India's gender bias is evident in the differential access to healthcare granted to men and women. As of 1st June 2021, there was a 15% gender gap, with a larger proportion of men getting their first vaccine shot. The gender gap is highest in the states of Jammu and Kashmir, Delhi, and Uttar Pradesh. These are some reports from the ground, and this is what from the data that my students have collected, and also from news reports. Neeja Sharma, aged 46, from Jaipur, Rajasthan, stated, and this is what she said about the situation. She said, "My husband thought it was right for him to get vaccinated first. Due to the possible side effects of Covishield, that is the vaccine, name of the vaccination, that is AstraZeneca, he needed me to take care of him while he was sick. And if I get ill along with him, who will cook and look after the house and our son?" Ram Kumari, age 26, from Gurugram, Haryana, said, "I didn't even know we had to register on the phone. I don't have a smartphone. My husband has one, but I don't know how to use it." A 46-year-old man, Jay Shankar Prasad, was asked if he and his family had gotten their shot. And he said, "I got mine last month, but my wife, what's the need? She stays inside the house." He shrugged, "I'll get her vaccinated eventually." These are some statistics. The country's vaccination rate is rising, with an average of more than 60 lakh daily vaccinations. 54% of men have received the vaccine, compared to 46% of women, a gap of 8%. India has 5% more men than women. Delhi and Uttar Pradesh, the two states, show the highest gender gap. In UP, only 42% of the vaccinated people are women. West Bengal, Dadra and Nagar Haveli, Daman and Diu, and Jammu and Kashmir are among the other regions performing poorly. According to a recent data, 349 per every 1,000 women and 390 per every 1,000 men aged above 18 have received at least one dose. Reports from the Union Health Ministry show that 14.99 crore women and 17.48 crore men have received the COVID-19 vaccine so far. And the reasons for this are listed here. The first is misinformation. Compared to men, misinformation is a concern among women, as many side effects are reported to affect more women. Vaccine hesitancy is exacerbated among women due to myths and rumors related to its impact on menstruation and fertility. The second, sexism. It is believed that women who do not usually travel long distances to get paid jobs do not need the COVID-19 vaccine. And since it's perceived that only men go out to work, it is their health that must be protected and prioritized over that of women. The third is the digital divide. They are more likely, that is men, they are more like, sorry, that is women, are more unlikely to have a mobile phone or know how to register for the CoWIN application. The CoWIN is the portal that is the government portal that all citizens desiring to get the vaccine have to register. The next reason is financial instability. Urban women as well have spent days trying to find slots on the CoWIN app, while women from rural communities are rarely prioritized and often don't even have smartphones or mobile data and cannot afford to take time off from work or travel to vaccination centers. Control of male members of households on resources is the other reason. In most rural households in India, women have less authority to make decisions about their health care, their bodies, and their lives as compared to their male counterparts. Most women in Indian households are financially dependent on the men in their families. In remote areas, vaccine hesitancy is more profound due to the literacy and pre-existing digital divide. Lower mobility and socio-cultural forces, no access to information, gadgets, and finances amongst women may make them less accepting of the vaccine. This also covers the vaccination gap in the trans community. According to a recent survey, of the total number of people vaccinated, trans citizens constitute 55.886, which accounts for only 0.01 0.01 of the national population and 11.45% of the total transgender population. And this is from, part of it is let's hear from them. My friend went and she was driven away by the people queuing outside and was told that she can't get vaccinated with them. I want to go with an appointment so that I'm treated the same way, but it's difficult to book one without a smartphone, said 44-year-old Samina. Alicia, a trans woman from Rajasthan, stated, "We are keeping ourselves indoors to be safe, but what if something happens after vaccination? Even rich people are not getting beds in hospitals. Who will bother about saving us?" Dr. Aksa Sheikh, India's first and only trans woman serving as a nodal officer at a vaccination center, believes that vaccine hesitancy is the first and the biggest obstacle between an Indian trans person and their complete vaccination. Lack of representation in vaccine trials, the underrepresentation of the trans community during vaccine research has led to concern around the vaccine, around how the vaccine would react to hormone supplements, gender affirmative surgery, STIs, or HIV/AIDS treatments. Experience with the Indian healthcare system, many among the community have been denied treatment based on their gender. Those who do receive it are harassed by insensitive procedures, hostile staff, and lack of washrooms. These kind of issues make it very difficult for them to go out and get vaccinated. Also, the lack of awareness and the misinformation that is prevalent. There are several myths related to the vaccine. One is that people who are HIV positive or have recently undergone surgery cannot take the vaccine, although there are no contraindications that people who are HIV positive or have had surgery can not get vaccinated. Lack of digital access. Vaccine slots can be booked only through the CoWIN portal. Smartphones are still a privilege for a major part of the trans community. The digital divide worsens the issue when combined with a literacy rate of only 54% in the trans community. Absence of government documents. Adding to their problems is the need for government documents. Most of them have no kind of documents that they possess. A field survey report says that in UP and Delhi, only 16.6% of trans persons have Aadhaar cards, that is the identity card. And even fewer have voter cards, driving license, or PAN cards, all important documents that the government issues. And once again, these are the reasons that misinformation, sexism, digital divide, financial instability, and the control of male members of household resources that are being cited as the reason for the COVID-19 vaccination gap. Now, in this section, I will highlight the difficulties faced by women students during the lockdown's forced e-learning. With college campuses being closed, a shift to the digital has again aggravated the gender divide between male and female students through the means of access that they are positioned within. And these are some of the headlines from print media. Uh, the first says, experts predict 20% increase in girls' school dropouts. What can we do about it? Most of the girls from families of migrant workers are in the vulnerable age where they are likely to get married. The second highlight says, fighting gender inequality in India during the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic will drive many women in India into poverty and food insecurity. In India, the pandemic may turn the clock back on women's empowerment. And women and girls worry that they will be forced to return to a time before their voices were heard, their potential was recognized, and their contributions to society were valued. COVID-19 rolls back progress on female education in India. In the last 1 year since the shift to remote learning, studies have documented the digital divide stemming from India's deep income disparities. There are currently 320 million student learners in India who have been negatively impacted by the transition, of which a large student demographic has been unable to keep up or respond to the demands that the online mode makes on them. In fact, there has been scant critical evaluation by the university of both logistical and affective difficulties that students have been facing during the pandemic. What is sought to be highlighted instead is institutional and organizational resilience, drowning out both vulnerabilities and failures, signaling in this their rated insignificance. The digital divide and disparities have created an educational apartheid, an exclusion marked by class and gender inequities, currently exacerbated by online distancing. This is in stark contrast to jingoistic assertions that hail a democratizing impulse of the digital bridging made possible by e-learning. Several students are forced to function without even the most basic of tools for their online classes, which includes laptops and personal computers, which are more often than not a luxury. And the possession of one does not guarantee unshared usage time within a family. There is also a gendered burden upon women students who are expected to negotiate a balance between academic commitments and household chores, one that their male classmates would typically be exempt from. In this, home as refuge and shelter is marked through as a site reaffirming systemic gendered differences. Young women who would have experienced greater independence on university campuses outside find themselves policed by their families, both for their online time and their offline lives within the confines of the home. According to the key indicators of household social consumption on education in India report, based on the 2017-2018 NSSO, fewer than 15% of rural Indian households have internet access, as opposed to 40% of urban Indian households. A mere 13% of people surveyed aged above 5 in rural areas, just 8.5 of females could use the internet. Girls in vulnerable households face increased domestic duties, inducing their inability to access online education either because of the inadequate access to the internet and gadgets, or because the male child and his the teaching of the male child, are prioritized. In the last 1 year, since the shift to e-learning or online teaching, as it is called here in India, there have been studies documenting the digital divide stemming from India's deep income disparities. There are currently 320 million student learners in India who've been negatively impacted by the transition, of which a large student demographic has been unable to keep up or respond to the demands that the online mode makes on them. In fact, there is there's scant regard for the kind of difficulties that these students have faced by the administration at university and colleges. According to Maya John, the image of seamless access to knowledge through virtual classrooms and repositories of e-resources appears like a mirage in the desert of crushing ground realities. In a McKinsey report titled Digital India, it is evident that out of approximately 525.3 million internet users in India, 390.9 million access the internet through mobile phones. We also have the recent assessments of telecom business and the World Economic Forum that by 2030, up to 80% of internet consumption in India will be through mobile devices. Clearly, the bulk of people who are expected to access e-learning are those who have nothing but smartphones to depend on. There is nothing positive about this, considering the poor quality of mobile internet in this country. For example, the February 2020 Speed Test Global Index, published by speedtest.net, shows that India ranks 128th out of 141 countries with respect to average mobile internet speed. According to recent calculations, India's average internet connection speed on mobile networks was 4.9 Mbps, which is not only lower than the global average of 7.2 Mbps, but way below the average internet speed in, say, countries like South Korea, Singapore, Japan, the USA, and several Scandinavian countries, of course. Neither can we overlook facts such as the limited lifespan of majority smartphones, battery, screen and storage capacity, and issues in lower grade, less expensive smartphones. The limited access to smartphones in lower income households where one such device is shared by multiple family members. The difficulty of studying long hours on a smartphone in comparison to studying from a personal computer or laptop, and the major strain that extensive mobile usage has on the eyes. Access to internet technology and electronic gadgets have to be contextualized within wider intersecting social realities like class and gender inequalities, which substantially limit the access of women from the laboring poor to such technology. Likewise, the digital divide along the axis of urban and rural India is not one that shall dissipate anytime soon. We can hardly expect the rural poor, who are still tied down by poorly paid, stigmatized manual work, to overnight become owners of smartphones and beneficiaries of ICT-enabled e-learning. This was Maya John. This is a photograph of a teenaged girl sitting on a roof of her tiled home with a mobile in the southern Indian state of Kerala, showing the students' struggle to attend online classes when internet signals are so weak. And as she says, we tried all places in my house, including verandas and roofs. And finally, I got fairly good signal only on top of our two-story house. And as you can see, she's very precariously balanced and sitting on the roof of her house. On November 2nd, 2020, Aishwarya Reddy, a young Dalit college student of Delhi University, committed suicide. In her final note, she wrote, quote, I am a burden for my family. My education is a burden. If I can't study, I can't live. Unquote. Her family says she had been stressed about a notice from her college asking her to vacate her hostel room during the lockdown, and her family not being able to afford a laptop for her to attend online classes. At the time of her admissions, her father, a motorcycle mechanic, mortgaged their home for rupees 2 lakh to support her education. Today, he has to pay back the loan with an interest of 24.5% at an EMI of rupees 4,904 until July 2026. Aishwarya's 16-year-old sister, Vaishnavi, dropped out of school after grade 7 to let the family accommodate her older sister's education. While Reddy says he would have gone to any extent to support Aishwarya's studies, the truth is he had already given most of what he had. In my presentation, I have sought to draw attention to some instances of aggravated distress that women have experienced during the pandemic. While it is important to reiterate that this moment of the virus has only brought to a crisis existing social inequities, interviews shared today of domestic workers through a student-led survey also attempts to share the experiences that women domestic workers have individually undergone. With this, there is also an attempt to shift the gaze from the suffering body onto the structures, systems, and policies that underpin it. In this is a complicating of the issue of visibility by creating a counter-visuality that does not flatten, romanticize, or make a spectacle of the struggles being documented. This gendered analysis and reading rests on the understanding that unequal power relations that undergird our social world are also contestable and further hierarchized by location. In the context of India, caste, religious community, class, and sexuality further re-signify access. In this case, the gender disparities in COVID care are immediate and visible within an empirical foregrounding. And there isn't an attempt to elide these within the larger in understanding of structural inequalities. In this, I'm also aware of how claiming to speak on behalf of the subaltern or having unmediated access to their speech is also a form of colonialism. As Gayatri Spivak's work on the training of the imagination for ethical intervention asks, with what voice consciousness can the subaltern speak? In this, Trinity Minha's understanding of speaking nearby instead of speaking for is helpful in thinking about the desire or willfulness to address a place that is not one's origin. Rather, this desire reveals one's own position towards the subject one is speaking about, an allyship that is described and problematized as the position of the unthought. With technological and digital means of communication, the nearby is no longer a question of spatial proximity, and it may refer to an intimacy that exceeds physical and temporal boundaries. And this has been the endeavor of students who have sought an understanding of experiences recorded here that I have brought into my presentation today. Thank you.